that's being developed right
So
now.
this is quite different from the general concept of components, right? Now we're talking about React components.
Exactly. So it is it's still a component, but it is a React component, and that comes with different things, different features, different stuff that's happening there. Okay. So let's dive into the code. Right here, you have a very, very simple component. Okay, so to actually create a component in React, you got to go react.createClass. All right, and then you pass it an object that's going to have a bunch of different functions that manipulates a state and all that stuff. So if you look here, this is a message component. What's being passed into this create class function is an object with a render function. Now, this is the only function that is required in a React component. You must have a render function. And what this render function is going to contain is basically the JSX that you're going to be writing, so the elements that you're going to be writing. So you'll notice here, this is a little funky, that you have HTML in your JavaScript.
Yeah.
Right there. So, and then you have some more JavaScript inside. So we'll actually explain what this JSX is in a second, but really the important part here is that this piece is everything that is going to make this message component. Okay, and you're going to be able to create a bunch of these message components. So this isn't an instance. This is actually a class of a component. So it's not a specific component instance itself.
Okay.
Right. So this var message component is not something that like it's not just one component. It's something that you're going to use to actually create more than one component.
Okay. So if I have a list, I might have a list of message components where there are
exactly.
a bunch of them. Okay.
Yeah. So even though we have a var here, that's not the case. So don't be confused by that. So you'll notice that beyond the JSX here, like you can ignore this piece. We'll cover it in a second. We just have this render function, and then to actually create an instance of our message component and put it into the document, the DOM, we need to call react dom.render, and then you'll notice that we have some more HTML here. But here we have our own new component called message component. And then we're giving it an attribute message equal to hello.
Okay. Right?
So if we go back into our message component up here, you'll notice that we're actually using this message through this thing called the props.
Okay.
And essentially what props are, they're properties that are passed into the component. And you'll notice that there's a this as well. And basically this refers to the component instant itself. So you don't have to bind things yourself in the React library. React auto binds for you. So there's a lot of things going on here. If you go back to our render function, you'll notice that we're rendering this message component to the document body. And yeah, there's just a lot of things going on.
And there's no accompanying HTML, right?
No,
this is what results in
exactly.
HTML.
So if you have an empty HTML file and then you include this JavaScript file in the head, and then it executes, this will add in the message component directly into the body of your page.
Okay.
Right. So we're rendering directly to document.body.
Okay.
So lots of things going on here. Let's actually dive a little bit more into the JSX piece. So this is what is JSX? It's essentially a way for you to write HTML in JavaScript.
Okay.
But it's a little special in the sense that it's actually not HTML. You run your JSX code through a transpiler like Babel, okay? And it will convert this HTML into actual React function calls. Right?
Okay, so this is a convenience for the developer.
Yeah.
You can't send JSX to a browser.
No, you cannot send JSX. It is literally just for us, the developer. What actually does get sent to the browser is a bunch of React functions that are creating these elements for you. Okay, so if we go back here and take a look at this return function right here, this piece right here, this is being converted into JavaScript, which is why you can actually put it in this JavaScript file.
Okay.
Right. So like this .props message is just referring like when this gets translated to JavaScript, it's just going to refer to the same this like the rest of the function is.
So this looks a little bit like there's some JavaScript in my HTML, but really there's some HTML in my JavaScript.
Exactly. Yeah. And then this HTML goes away; it becomes JavaScript.
Yeah.
So this is essentially what the component is. Components have props; they also have a state. We'll cover that a little bit more later in the third module. But essentially, that's what it is. That's all you need to actually build a component. You need the create class call with this object that has a render function, and then you pass it to React DOM if you want to render to the DOM.
Okay.
Now, React DOM is its own library as well, so if you want to render to something other than the DOM, there's other ways that you could do that, but generally people use React with React DOM.
Okay. So can we take what we've learned so far about components in general, but here specifically React components, and use those to make a component in our sample application?
Exactly. So actually, that's what we're going to do right now.
So it's time to write some code.
Yeah, we're gonna dive into our code right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to build the app, the inbox pane, and the inbox item components. All right. So I'm going to switch out of these slides right here, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go to our GitHub repo. So if you take a look, this is the GitHub repo that you might have downloaded or cloned.
This is what you have right after you cloned. Yep.
Exactly. And then we're going to go into the second module right here, go into the code folder, and then we're going to go into the start folder. All right, so this is the starting point for this module. So at the end, the end result, you can actually see that in the end folder, but we're going to, because we're doing this live, we're going to start with the start folder. Now, you can right-click and open with code, and I'm going to run you through the projects to show you what's in here. Once code has loaded up, you can see all the files in your start folder right here. And you'll notice there's a couple of things that are going on here. You have a package.json. So this package.json is the full one that you're going to find at the end of this app. Okay, and let me run you through it to show you what we've got in here. We've named this the Pizza Pot Manager. We've given it a little description. The main here is this server.js that we'll cover in module 6. You can ignore it.
Point.
Yeah, it's the entry point for the server side. You can ignore it for now. But there is a scripts element right here that's contains a couple of things. It's got this start webpack server. Okay, so this little script is going to actually run the webpack dev server that's going to compile and collect all the React code. So it'll do the transpilation process for us, and it will even do the hot module reloading. All right, so that as you're writing your code, you can actually see it automatically refresh in the browser. We'll cover how we set that up in module 5. And for now, just you can actually just run this little script once you've got Webpack and everything installed, and you don't have to worry about it.
What about an npm install?
Right. So what you need to npm install for Webpack is quite simple. You do an npm install global Webpack, and for the dev server, you would type that in. So if you press enter here, it should install everything. Now I've already got things installed, so it'll
so you have to install those things globally, but then when they're using your demo here, then they need to do an npm install to get the package dependencies. Yeah. So there are other packages that we are depending on. So if we scroll down right here, these are the dependency packages that are basically that the application will depend on. So bot builder is for the bot piece that we'll cover in module 6. So is the Express, so that's the Node Express web framework. jQuery we're going to be using a little bit later. The crucial point for this piece of this module is the React and the React DOM module the dependencies. All right, and for the dev dependencies to actually be able to build this project, you'll see the dev dependencies are there. We've got Webpack in there, the Babel transpiler as well, including a couple of presets. So Babel is very plugin friendly. So here we're plugging in the React plugin and the ES 2015 plugin, so that Babel will transpile any of the ES 2015 features and the JSX stuff. And then we've got the loaders as well for Webpack that we'll cover a little bit later. So to get started in this project, you should do an npm install. So I've already got my Webpack stuff installed, but if I go into my second module here and I go into start, I can also run an npm install, and it will install all my dependencies for me. Okay. I've already done that. So what I can do now that I've done that is I can actually run the Webpack server. So it'll actually be run start Webpack server. That's the name that we gave our script. So if I scroll back here, that's what it is, start Webpack server.
So if I run this, it's actually going to run Webpack, and it's going to bundle all the modules for me, including all the React modules that I depend on. Right now, because this is the starting point, if I go into my app folder right here, there's actually nothing in my JavaScript, and there's nothing in my HTML.
Yeah.
But it will still bundle all this stuff together. It'll have it running, and then I can actually go into my browser here, go into localhost 8080, and of course do that wrong. And you'll notice that I have my title. It is serving the index.
It looks great so far.
Yeah, so far. So going back to our Visual Studio Code here, besides the package.json that's contains some interesting things. If you want to take a look at the Webpack configuration, it is in webpack.config.js, but we will cover it a little bit later. The app itself is very simple. We've got an HTML file that just says, pizza chain bot manager. It references a style sheet, and then it references this bundle.js. This JavaScript file is what is bundled by Webpack.
Okay.
All right. So Webpack will take app.js, and then in a couple of modules later, perhaps some of the other components as well, and it will bundle them into one file that will be served to our index.html.
Okay, so this is a really good starting point. It's kind of an empty slate now. We're ready to go ahead and write our stuff. But supposedly you have cloned this at home, and you are, you're up to speed here, and we're going to go ahead and start writing a component in the next video.
Yeah.
So stay tuned. All right, now let's go ahead and take a look at building the first components in our sample application. We're actually going to be building the app component. That's kind of an encapsulating component for the whole application. And then the inbox pane and the inbox item.
That's right. So you've seen how our folder structure is set up. We're in the app.js file right now. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to actually want to require React. So to do that, I can... obviously, if I type correctly, require React, right, like that. And I also want to require the React DOM, specifically so that I can render to the DOM, so I can render to my browser. Once I've got that set up, to actually tell it to render something, I can do the React DOM.render, as we saw earlier. And the first component I wanted to tell it to render is the app component. So you'll notice that I'm putting in some JSX right there, okay? And I want it to render to a div in my index.html. So if I go back here, you'll notice that I have a div ID with the ID main. That's where I want to render my React component to. So it'll actually put everything in that div. So to do that, I'm going to actually go fetch it by doing document.getElementById. Giving it the ID main. And once I create my app component, this should render properly. So let's actually create that component. So I do that by writing create class and passing in the only function that's required, which is the render function. So if I do that right like this.
We got a misspelling up there. Function is spelled wrong in line 5.
Of course, I always do that.
I do that too. Same exact misspelling.
And don't forget to return something. Okay, and so you can actually return this way if you wanted to write everything in one line. But if you do want to split up into multiple lines, you do need the parentheses right there. Okay, so you can basically do this like that. Okay, so if I render, you'll notice here that Visual Studio Code is very smart. It's telling me that I need to actually put in a closing tag, right? And in JSX, it is a lot stricter than HTML. So you do need to have a closing tag for every single element.
So Rami, Visual Studio Code is aware of this JSX and able to say that even though this is in HTML inside of JavaScript, which doesn't seem legal, it's able to parse that as HTML.
Yeah, and this is actually part of a very recent update to Visual Studio Code.
Okay.
And they changed the JavaScript piece that sort of does the IntelliSense and does all that piece. It's the language service that was updated recently to support things like React.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's able to parse.
It's using Salsa now.
Yes, that's right. That's the name of the language service. So it's able to parse into the JSX code right here and actually tell me I'm missing the closing tag, right? So if I actually do this right now, if I go back into my Webpack, you'll notice that it is bundling things now. So it's still running from the last time that I ran it. And you'll notice that it is bundling a whole bunch of React stuff now. Okay, so if I go back into my page right here, and I sort of scroll into this, sort of open up the DevTools, you can press F12 to do that as well. I can actually go into my React piece, my ID main, and you'll notice that I have this div that I actually created, and you'll notice the data-react root.
Yeah.
So React is working in my app right now, and it is actually adding in this div, right? So now this div right now is empty, so let's actually include some stuff inside. So perhaps I want to have, if you remember, our sample app looked like this. Okay, we had a thing at the top, sort of like the header. We have our inbox pane and our conversation, our storage pane. So why don't we go ahead and add sort of a header. So if I go in here, I can add in a div, give it an ID of header, close that tag right there. And perhaps I want to have a div that contains all the columns.
Okay.
Right? Here's something that's interesting. Because class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, you actually have to type in class name.
Okay.
And that's how you specify the classes for your JSX or your HTML elements. So if I do that like this, I can close it at the bottom right here. So if I save, you'll notice that my commander is giving me a little bit of a highlight, and that's because Webpack is rebundling the JavaScript. And as it does that, it also updates the page itself. So you'll notice that inside my div, I now have a header and a container.
That's excellent. So this is a good workflow. It's you don't have to reissue.
I can even sort of put it on the side here and put React on this side. Yeah. And as I'm typing, although right now it's zoomed in, as I'm typing code in, it'll automatically refresh in my browser. Yeah. Okay, but we won't do that right now. We'll actually just zoom
make best use
everything.
Of our screen real estate.
Exactly.
Here, yeah.
But if you're at home and you've got a nice big screen, you can actually get a split pane right there. So Webpack will be running in the background. As you're typing in code, it'll hot reload your page, add in all the components, and do that live for you so you can see the changes directly.
Very cool.
So it's very similar to Browser Sync and some of the other tools that are available in the full version of Visual Studio that lets you do something similar. I think it's called Browser Link in Visual Studio. That's right. Okay, so that is our first component. It basically has, it's the app component. And the way that we're seeing this, this app is that it's sort of like this component is going to contain all the other components. Okay, so now actually let's create another component that's going to go inside this component. So this next one, I'm going to call it a var inbox pane. So again, you'll notice that I'm going to be typing in React create class quite frequently, and that is because that's how we create classes. So you'll notice here I have the one function that's required, which is the render function. And what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to actually create a div. So something to know about React, you cannot have more than one root element. So if I do this again, and you'll notice that there's a squiggly line right here. JSX expressions must have one parent element. So this is, again, Visual Studio Code sort of reading the JSX and telling us that we can't do that. So let's remove this right here.
So if that were the case and you wanted a component with two divs, you could obviously still accomplish that. You just have to wrap it with something.
You have to wrap it in another div.
Okay.
Yeah. So here what we're going to do is we're going to just give this div an ID, call it the inbox pane. Okay. And then maybe give it an h1 tag to say this is the inbox. All right. So now that I've got this component, this is pretty much the bare minimum. We did forget to do one thing, which is actually return this JSX. So once I've got that in there now, maybe we'll just move this to the side. Webpack should be able to, it is properly running. And it was able to make a valid bundle. I can actually now go back to my app component and create another div, give it a class name of maybe column. So this is the first column, okay? And you'll notice that we'll simplify the structure as we move on in our sample. And here is where it gets interesting. I can actually put in this inbox pane right here. So now this component is going to go inside this component. So if I go back here, the Webpack module has properly bundled everything. It says the bundle is valid. If I go back in here, you'll notice I have my inbox component. It's in a column. It has a different color. So if I go back into here, I can see my column, and there's my inbox pane right there.
Now that has color already only because we left a CSS file in there. That's not anything built in.
Yeah, so we have a CSS file. We can even take a look at it right here. It's got a bunch of different colors, and this class name of column is something that's already defined in our CSS file, so it's able to actually do all that work.
And we'll talk about all that styling stuff in a little bit.
Yeah. So maybe the next thing I want to do is actually sort of just add in the other columns, because we did have more columns as well, and we can't forget the closing divs. Otherwise, the React IntelliSense stuff will complain. So that's it for our app component. The next thing I want to do is actually create that inbox item component that we talked about as well. So we're going to do a very similar thing here and go actually react.createClass again. So if I do that, this one's going to be really simple. Again, also just a render function. And here we're going to return a table row. So there's a reason why I'm doing this, is because I do want to have a table for my inbox, and it's going to contain a couple of different columns. Among them, the time of this inbox item, so perhaps 5 p.m. So if I close it right like that, maybe like what the last message was. Rami loves pizza is a very true message, and maybe sort of the status of the order.
Okay.
So confirmed, perhaps. Okay. So I'm going to want to put this inbox item into the inbox pane. So to do that, I'm going to actually create the table right here. All right, so apologies for all the typos. I'm not really used to this keyboard. Perhaps we want to have a header as well that actually just explains what all these columns are. And so maybe another column for the name. And another one for the status. I'm really bad at typing today. I'm going to apologize for that.
I believe every developer in the world can relate.
So if I save now, Webpack will actually rebundle everything, and it tells me the bundle is still valid. So now I can actually add the t-body for my table. And this is going to contain our inbox item. So I have my inbox item right here. So now if I save this, Webpack has already executed. It's really fast. Go back to my localhost. You'll notice it's already been refreshed. You see how fast that is? That's a very fast code dev debug cycle.
Yeah, which is important because every extra second when it happens 150 times a day is a very
like I didn't even have time to actually see it being refreshed. I just literally switched, and then it was already there.
Yeah.
So it's something that's really powerful. So you can see here we've got our inbox element. This is the inbox item, that table row, okay, and it does fit into our columns right here. And there you have it. That is the app component, the inbox component, and then the inbox item component.
All right, now that's good for, we've written some actual code. Next, we're going to take a look at some kind of miscellaneous considerations and features in React, because we're in a kind of a new space here. And then we'll also take a look at the styling. You already saw the styling take effect, and we'll glance at how that works.
Awesome.
All right, welcome back to React.js. We're talking now about a few miscellaneous considerations in your React framework. We're going to talk about refs. We're going to talk about some interactivity and
setting states and all that stuff.
There you go, and then some styling. So
Yeah, so let's take a look at my screen. I've got a very simple like button over here. This is a component like any other component, but there's a couple of things I want to highlight here because we're gonna get back in future modules to this. So if you take a look, there's a couple of interesting functions. There's the get initial state function, and this returns a state object. All right, so what happens with every component in React is that all the state is contained in the state object that you could reference through dis.state. Okay, so when we create a function get initial state, React is actually going to call that and then sort of set the initial state right away for us, so that when it renders something, and we'll cover how things get rendered and what part of this life cycle this state gets set up. When it renders something, it'll actually be able to get that from the state, and you'll be able to change that in the state. And then this is different from the props that we saw earlier. The props are how properties get passed down to other components. State is instead this thing that's set inside the component. That's ideally the data that's encapsulated by this component. If I take a look again at our render function right here, there's a little bit more going on. We have a var text that actually takes a look at state, whether this component this button has been liked or not, so liked or haven't liked, and then it returns this paragraph tag that has an onClick. So you notice here that the syntax is a little bit different. We have our little curly braces here. There's no quotes, okay, and that's because we're gonna tell React to actually call the dis.handleClick, which is a function that takes an event in our component itself. So there's no quotation marks here. This is the React way of doing things. And then you might have a reference to the text itself. All right, so here we're referencing the actual text variable that's in this render function. All right, and then this will be either you liked or haven't liked this, click the toggle. And then if they click on this paragraph, it'll execute the handleClick function. Here is how we can set state, for example. So in our initial state, we return this object that has a liked equal a false property, this key value pair. Inside this set state, we're going to do the same thing. And here what we're going to do is we're going to set this like state to the opposite of what it was before. So the couple of things going on here are pretty interesting. There's one more thing that I'd like to add that you're gonna see later on besides the state as well. We're going to actually talk a little bit more about the state a little later. But I did want to cover it before we talk about the lifecycle, because otherwise the lifecycle component stuff wouldn't make particularly much sense.
Okay.
So I did want to cover it really quick here. But there is one last thing that I do want to show you, and I'm going to switch to my code right here. And that is what this refs thing is, and you'll see this happen quite a bit. So if I was in my inbox item and I wanted to refer to this specific HTML element, I can actually give it a ref. Okay, and then give it something like a name. All right, and then in my render function or any other function, perhaps maybe in my one of my lifecycle methods that we'll cover in a second, like component did mount is an example of one of those. I can actually refer to this element specifically by going to this.refs.name, for example. Okay, and if I wanted to get the value of this, it would be value. So you can think of this as a way for you to actually reference form elements. So if this wasn't a TD, it was maybe perhaps a input element, you're able to reference the value that's in the input element. All right, so the ref functionality is really handy. All right, and we're gonna get back. You might see it throughout the code every once in a while to reference an element inside our actual component.
Now, is that giving you essentially a DOM element? I know it's not really a DOM element, it's in React, but do I expect to see all the same properties on, say, a TD or an input that I would if I were working in the DOM?
Yeah, very similar properties. Like value, for example, would be the same value that you'd expect if you had an input element. It's the same idea right here. Yeah. The other thing that we wanted to talk about here is also styling components.
So if you switch over to my screen here, I've kind of jumped forward in time and I'm showing you what the application is going to look like, what we're eventually going to work to. We put some styling in here, and once again, we're not claiming this to be a work of beauty, but at least it has a number of styling elements so that you can see how this would be accomplished, okay? So this is the styling result. You can see that we've got our panes colored differently. In the conversation specifically, we we're differentiating between the two different voices and even rendering some icons there so that you can actually see who's speaking, what's going on, quickly make sense of what